After Venezuela, who's next? What if Venezuela was not the end of a crisis but the beginning of a message? When the United States under Donald Trump openly escalates pressure on a sovereign country like Venezuela, the real story is not confined to Caracas. The real question echoes far beyond Latin America. Who is next and why? History shows that major powers rarely act in isolation. Every intervention, sanction, or show of force sends a signal to allies, rivals, and neutral states alike. Venezuela, with its oil wealth, political instability, and defiance of Washington, fits a familiar pattern. But patterns do not stop with one country. This video is not about speculation or fear-mongering. It is about strategy. In this analysis, we break down the reality-based logic behind Trump's foreign policy to answer one critical question. Which countries could realistically come under U.S. pressure after Venezuela? By examining power interests, geography, economic leverage, and past behavior, this video explains why Cuba, Mexico, Colombia, Greenland, and Iran repeatedly appear in serious geopolitical discussions. If Venezuela was a signal, then this video decodes the message and reveals what it means for the future global order. Understanding Trump's foreign policy logic before examining individual countries, it is essential to understand the framework Trump typically uses when dealing with foreign governments. Trump's worldview is transactional and power-centric. He tends to divide countries into three broad categories: useful partners, those that provide economic, security, or political benefits to the U.S., manageable rivals, states that challenge U.S. interests but can be pressured through sanctions or negotiations, problem states, governments portrayed as corrupt, weak, hostile, or illegitimate, and therefore acceptable targets for coercion. Venezuela clearly fell into the third category in Trump's narrative. The same logic helps identify which countries might be next. Key recurring themes in Trump's approach include restoring American dominance, preventing rivals from gaining influence near U.S. borders using economic and military pressure rather than diplomacy-first strategies, appealing to domestic audiences by projecting strength abroad. With this framework in mind, the list of potential targets becomes more predictable. 1. Cuba, the most immediate pressure point. Why Cuba matters after Venezuela? Cuba is often considered the most vulnerable country in the aftermath of increased pressure on Venezuela. For decades, Cuba relied heavily on subsidized Venezuelan oil, financial assistance, and political backing. Any serious disruption to Venezuela's capacity or willingness to support Havana automatically places Cuba under strain. From Washington's perspective, Cuba represents unfinished business from the Cold War era. Trump has consistently framed the Cuban government as economically weak, politically isolated, dependent on external support. Strategic objectives toward Cuba. A post-Venezuela strategy toward Cuba would likely focus on tightening economic pressure, forcing political concessions, encouraging internal dissent, reducing Cuba's ability to act as a regional symbol of resistance. Trump's rhetoric has often suggested that Cuba should make a deal with the United States or face deeper isolation. This framing positions pressure not as aggression but as an offer: comply or suffer consequences. Limits of U.S. action. Despite strong rhetoric, Cuba also presents constraints. Direct military action would be politically costly. International backlash could be severe. Regime change through force is unlikely. Therefore, Cuba is best understood as a pressure target, not a battlefield. Economic and diplomatic coercion rather than invasion. 2. Colombia, ally, or next flashpoint. A complicated relationship. Colombia has historically been one of Washington's closest allies in Latin America. However, alliances can become strained when political leadership changes or national priorities diverge. Under Trump's worldview, Colombia risks scrutiny for two main reasons: persistent drug trafficking issues, political leadership that questions U.S. regional actions. If a Colombian government openly criticizes U.S. actions in Venezuela or seeks closer ties with non-Western powers, it can quickly move from ally to problem state in Washington's eyes. The drug war narrative. Trump frequently frames international issues through the lens of domestic security. Drug trafficking is one of the most powerful justifications for external pressure because it directly affects U.S. voters. In this narrative, weak governance equals security threat. Sovereignty becomes secondary to U.S. safety. Military solutions appear justified. Colombia, with its long history of armed groups and narcotics production, could be portrayed as a necessary front in an expanded regional security strategy. Realistic outcomes: while a full confrontation with Colombia is unlikely, possible pressure tools include increased U.S. military presence, conditional aid intelligence operations. Diplomatic coercion: Colombia's importance lies not in being a target itself, but in becoming a buffer state or staging ground for broader regional objectives. 3. Mexico, the border, cartels, and sovereignty. Why Mexico is always on the radar. Mexico occupies a unique position in U.S. foreign policy. It is not just a neighbor, but a domestic political issue inside the United States. For Trump, Mexico is central to three highly emotional themes: illegal immigration, drug trafficking, border security. Any escalation in rhetoric toward Mexico serves both foreign and domestic political purposes. The cartel justification. Trump has repeatedly suggested that drug cartels represent a national security threat comparable to terrorist organizations. This framing opens the door to cross-border operations, intelligence interventions, unilateral action justified as self-defense. If Mexico resists U.S. involvement, that resistance itself can be portrayed as negligence or weakness. Constraints and risks. Despite aggressive language, Mexico also presents serious risks. Economic interdependence is deep. Military action would destabilize trade. Political fallout would be severe. Therefore, Mexico is less likely to face overt military action and more likely to experience constant pressure, threats, and negotiations under duress. 4. Greenland. Power politics in the Arctic. Why Greenland keeps returning to the discussion. Greenland may seem unrelated to Venezuela, but strategically it fits perfectly into Trump's worldview. It represents military positioning, resource access, competition with China and Russia. Trump's earlier interest in Greenland was widely mocked, but behind the rhetoric lies serious strategic logic. Strategic importance: Greenland offers control over Arctic shipping routes, access to rare earth minerals, expanded missile defense and surveillance capabilities. As climate change opens the Arctic, Greenland's value increases dramatically. Diplomatic reality: Greenland is an autonomous territory of Denmark, a NATO ally. Any U.S. pressure would be diplomatic rather than military. Possible actions include expanded U.S. military presence, economic investments, political influence campaigns. Greenland represents 21st century geopolitics, where control is exerted through economics and security partnerships rather than force. 5. Iran. Outside the hemisphere, inside the strategy. Why Iran still matters after Venezuela. Iran stands outside Latin America but remains central to Trump's global strategy. Any major U.S. action sends signals not only regionally but globally. Iran's relevance includes nuclear ambitions, regional influence, alliance with U.S. adversaries. Iran's vocal opposition to U.S. actions anywhere in the world often brings it back into Washington's focus. The pattern of escalation. Trump's past approach to Iran shows a pattern: maximum economic pressure, symbolic military actions, public threats followed by negotiations. Iran is less likely to be the next immediate target, but it remains a constant pressure point, a reminder that U.S. power is global, not regional. Other countries. Speculation versus reality. Some analysts mention countries such as Nicaragua, Panama, or even non-state actors. These discussions should be treated cautiously. Without clear strategic value, domestic political justification, public signaling, such targets remain speculative rather than realistic. The bigger picture, a new Monroe Doctrine? The most important takeaway is not the list of countries, but the pattern. Trump's actions suggest a revival of a hard power interpretation of U.S. influence, particularly in regions historically considered America's backyard. Key characteristics of this approach include reduced respect for multilateral institutions, emphasis on unilateral action, blurring lines between economic and military pressure. Venezuela is not an endpoint. It is a signal. Conclusion: who is really in Trump's sights? After Venezuela, the countries most likely to face increased U.S. pressure under Trump are Cuba, economically vulnerable and politically isolated. Mexico, constantly framed as a domestic security issue. Colombia, a strategic ally that could become a pressure zone. Greenland, a strategic asset in global competition. Iran, a long-term adversary always in the background rather than sudden wars. Trump's strategy favors pressure, leverage, and dominance. Understanding this logic is essential to understanding what comes next, not just for these countries, but for the global order itself.